Like so many others these days, Russian troops are frequent users of social media. But instead of cat videos or dance routines, their posts are sobering reminders of the horrors of war. The videos uploaded by Russian soldiers are giving the world unprecedented insight behind the scenes of the invasion of Ukraine. However, some of the more recent news footage shows scenes no one expected to see: Iranian soldiers on the front line. In a video recorded on a GoPro, some members of the Russian forces on the ground in Ukraine aren't speaking Russian, but Persian, a language spoken practically only in Iran. This suggests that there are now Iranians in the Russian armed forces. If you're wondering how this happened, well, the short, obvious answer is that Russia has started importing Iranian soldiers, or just straight-up volunteers, into its ranks. But the long answer involves a catastrophic cascade of military miscalculations, demographic disasters, and institutional rot that has transformed Russia from a perceived superpower into a hungry predator, consuming manpower at an unsustainable rate. And with Iranian troops joining North Korean cannon fodder on Ukrainian battlefields, we're witnessing what could very well be the final chapter of Russia's transformation into a dependent state. Let's dissect the anatomy of Russia's manpower crisis and what it means for the future of this war, but also of modern war itself. This isn't just about military tactics or geopolitical maneuvering. This is about understanding how a nation that has nuclear weapons at the ready has managed to systematically destroy its own human capital, and why that should terrify everyone watching this unfold. To understand how Russia arrived at this point, it's best to take a trip through the history of the war. This time we'll use an often forgotten lens of military demographics. In truth, it wasn't really the Iranians or even North Koreans that were the first casualties of Russia's failure to create a proper strategy and utilize its overwhelming military advantage. That honor belongs to native Russians themselves. If we roll back the clock, when Russia launched its special military operation in February 2022, President Vladimir Putin believed Russia's professional army of approximately 150,000 troops stationed around the border would steamroll Ukraine within days. These were supposed to be Russia's elite forces, well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-tested from conflicts in Syria and elsewhere. Compounding that, the rest of the Russian military was roughly 900,000 men strong at the start of the war, at least according to statistics posted by Russia itself and calculations by independent experts. But that initial confidence evaporated within weeks. As soon as Ukraine managed to stall Russia's advance into Kyiv, the war practically developed into one of attrition, stemming from the fact that Putin didn't really prepare for a prolonged conflict in the first place. According to US assessments and news reports directly from the Kremlin, Russia is estimated to have roughly 60% more troops poised to fight in Ukraine than it did when it invaded in February. This includes thousands of convicts released from prison and conscripts from repeated and controversial mobilization drives. But all this massive expansion does is tell a story of quality being sacrificed for quantity at an unprecedented scale. Think of it this way. Imagine a professional sports team that starts a season with their star players, then progressively replaces them with college players, then high school students, and then anyone willing to hold a ball. That's essentially what happened to Russia's military for slightly more than 3 years. The first pivot came with Wagner Group mercenaries. Wagner began recruiting prisoners in Russia's sprawling penal system in the summer of 2022, with Prigozhin offering convicts a pardon if they survived 6 months in Ukraine. Remember, this was only mere months after the war started, when the casualty numbers were still estimated to be in the low 5 figures. But the fact that Russia almost immediately resorted to using mercenaries suggested that Russia's existing military had already been decimated and would take years to recover, which we've started seeing through middling conscription efforts. The prisoner recruitment wasn't a small-scale operation. In December 2022, the UK Ministry of Defence claimed Wagner had 50,000 fighters in Ukraine, with a proposed split of around 10,000 contractors and 40,000 convicts, according to John Kirby, the United States National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications. To put that in perspective, Russia was deploying more prisoners to the front than many countries currently have in their entire armed forces. Also, by that count, the 50,000 Wagner soldiers made up around 20% of Russian forces on the ground at the time, making them a vital group that Putin relied on to conduct his war. By early 2023, even this desperate measure had run its course. Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin announced in February 2023 that the recruitment of prisoners by the Wagner private military company has completely stopped. This obviously wasn't because the strategy was successful. as the Russian forces made little to no progress on the front and Ukraine managed to recapture most of the territory Russia invaded in the early months of the war. The more likely reasoning was that the company had either exhausted the pool of willing recruits, or the news or rumors of massive casualties made recruitment impossible due to a lack of willing participants. What came next reveals the true scope of Russia's manpower crisis. The Russian Ministry of Defense itself began recruiting prisoners in October 2022. These recruits would end up going into the Storm Z series units, after receiving only 10 to 15 days of training before being attached to regular Russian forces suffering from battle fatigue. The Storm Z troops technically started as something similar to an elite corps in the Russian military in early 2022, but suffered the same fate as the rest of the Russian army by failing to make a dent in the Ukrainian defenses. In April 2023, the Institute for the Study of War described each Storm Z company as outside of conventional army unit structure, yet somehow attached to existing Russian regiments and brigades. By mid-2023, these troops began to be seen as penal units, sent to the parts of the front line that were most likely to suffer significant attrition and losses in the coming weeks. After the Russian convicts were cycled through at an accelerated rate and with uncertain futures both inside the Russian military and outside of it, we arrive at the current phase, foreign conscription. This stage technically lasted over 6 months, starting in October 2024, when over 10,000 North Korean troops joined Russian forces in Kursk. The deployment of North Korean troops was channeled under the pre-existing North Korea-Russia military and geopolitical alliance. When Ukraine invaded the Kursk region, Russia conveniently had an excuse to claim that its own territory was being threatened, triggering the defensive alliance and transporting 10,000 of its allies' troops to the region to make up roughly 20% of the standing army there. The North Korean troops performed as well as you could expect, considering that the country had some of the lowest technical capabilities and actual military preparedness in the world, despite inflated active troop size numbers. They suffered high casualties, with some sources claiming that there were roughly 3,000 dead or injured North Korean troops in just 3 months of warfare. In April 2025, after 6 months, the estimate rose to 5,000, one-third of those being deaths. The 30% plus attrition rate, which was technically superior to Russia's own military numbers, and the lack of progress in Kursk led to the troops being shuttled away from the front line and only sparingly mentioned as time went on. In May 2025, Russia seemingly integrated even more international allies into its ranks, with Iranians likely being among the foreigners joining its military. This progression from professional military to mercenaries to prisoners to foreign troops represents one of the most dramatic military deteriorations in modern history. This doesn't mean that Russia is adapting to the changing landscape of the war in Ukraine. If it were, we would see more of its own troops on the front, and the numerically advantaged army would actually be making progress in the war. If Russia starts depending more and more on foreign troops while supposedly being one of the largest militaries in the world, it will send a clear signal that it's exhausting its own troops and using foreigners as placeholders until recruits can be acquired and trained. Of course, you might think that Russia can actually win the war if it conducts conscription for a long period and in large enough numbers. After all, Ukraine is suffering from attrition as well, and its military started and maintained a much smaller troop size throughout the conflict. But there's one fatal flaw in this argument. Armies aren't just collections of armed individuals, they're complex organizations that depend on communication, trust, shared doctrine, and cultural understanding to function effectively. When Russia began importing foreign fighters, its already loose and outdated doctrine began to splinter and fall apart at the seams. Let's start with the most obvious problem: language barriers. Modern warfare depends on split-second communication and coordination. When a Russian commander needs to redirect artillery fire or coordinate a retreat, every second matters. Now imagine trying to bark orders in Russian, having one or more translators pick up on those orders and relay them to all the other troops, and hope that everyone got the same message. It's a practically impossible effort, and one that was already tested and failed in Kursk. When the North Korean troops started appearing in Kursk, Ukrainian military intelligence tapped into conversations from native Russian soldiers lamenting the change. One of the more notable comments was that North Koreans didn't know a lick of Russian or even English, relying on translators who weren't dispatched until after the first few weeks. The intelligence suggested that North Koreans would rely on one translator for every 6 soldiers. Extrapolate that to 10,000 troops and you have over 1,600 translators on the battlefield. Were these translators Korean higher officers who both knew Russian and Korean and could act as go-betweens for Russian officers and their own underlings? Or were they completely separate soldiers that would also need to be trained and protected? Neither option sounded good for keeping the troops unified. And the problems go beyond language and into what soldiers were trained to fight against or how to fight as a unit. According to South Korean intelligence, the heavy losses among North Korean troops were attributed to their lack of experience in drone warfare and unfamiliarity with the open terrain where they were engaging in battle. It's simple. North Korean soldiers trained for mountain warfare in their homeland suddenly found themselves in the flat, drone-saturated battlefield of eastern Ukraine. They had negligible support from Russian troops and sometimes acted independently from them, which could create even more confusion. The chain of command problems are even more complex. Russian military doctrine is built around centralized control, where orders flow down through established hierarchies. But what happens when half your unit doesn't understand the cultural context of these orders? In one of the more devastating blunders, North Korean troops were sent to attack a contingent of Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk. The Russian military also sent Chechen soldiers as reinforcements to strike from another angle. However, either Russia failed to properly inform the North Korean troops of the strategy, or the North Korean troops were even less organized than they seemed, as they ended up shooting at the Chechen reinforcements instead. Multiple Russian, Chechen, and North Korean troops were killed solely due to friendly fire, showcasing the potential danger of multinational militaries fighting without coordination. Of course, it's far more likely that Putin had this exact scenario in mind and directly used North Korean troops as proxies for native Russians to avoid his own country paying the toll of the war. This approach to viewing soldiers on the ground as expendable would end up being replicated even inside the Russian army itself, which we'll discuss a bit later. The core of the problem lies in Russia being unable to use its own military effectively. To understand why Russia required foreign troops, it's important to examine the structural issues that led to this manpower crisis. This involves not only the war in Ukraine, but also decades of institutional challenges that the conflict has revealed. Russian military doctrine has remained essentially unchanged since the Soviet era. Centralized command, overwhelming numerical superiority, and acceptance of massive casualties to achieve objectives. The primary doctrine is defending Russian territories against an alleged NATO invasion. This suggested that Russia was preparing for a defensive war rather than an offensive one, and one which utilized ground troops as key links for other parts of Russia's military, such as the Navy or the Air Force. This strategy would work if Russia was on the defensive, as the troops would be inside Russia itself, and the defensively positioned Navy and Air Force would leverage the freedom to move inside Russia's waters and airspace. But in the war in Ukraine, that didn't happen. Russia could only use a part of its Black Sea fleet to pressure Ukraine, and even that was quickly repelled by naval drone attacks. Its air force, roughly 10 times the size of Ukraine and with more modern aircraft, couldn't enforce air superiority over the Ukrainian airspace due to layered defenses and possibly even long-standing communications and electronics issues within the planes themselves. Regardless, the outcome is the same. Russia was compelled to deploy primarily its ground forces in foreign territories, where they would not have support from other branches of the military. And the ramifications of that became clear rather quickly. According to Prigozhin himself, the leader of Wagner, Russia had lost around 120,000 troops by mid-2023, with the Wagner group losing more than 20,000 soldiers. This was after starting with only a few thousand original members and recruiting 40,000 convicts. By 2024, the casualty rate accelerated, with Western estimates suggesting Russia will lose another 300,000 during 2023 and 400,000 troops during 2024. According to the latest British Ministry of Defence assessment, Russian casualties have likely approached 900,000 killed and wounded since the invasion began in 2022. This is more troops dead and injured than the entire country had in active deployment at the start of the war, suggesting that the entire military was essentially replaced with fresh recruits or people who had previously left the military. The centralized command structure that once seemed like a strength has become a fatal weakness in modern warfare. When every tactical decision must be approved by higher command, units become sitting ducks for Ukrainian drones and artillery that can strike faster than Russian bureaucracy can respond. But the deeper problem is corruption. Russia's military budget officially ranks among the world's largest, siphoning roughly 40% of the country's total government budget for 2025. But much of that money has been siphoned off through decades of systemic corruption. Equipment that exists on paper doesn't exist in reality. Training programs that should prepare soldiers for modern warfare instead prepare them for parades. Weapon systems that should provide technological advantages break down due to poor maintenance and substandard components. The lack of professional military education compounds these problems. Modern warfare requires continuous adaptation to new technologies, tactics, and threats. However, Russia's centralized system discourages innovation and independent thinking among officers. The result is a military that keeps using Soviet-era tactics against an enemy equipped with 21st century technology and Western intelligence. Here's where Russia's crisis becomes truly sinister. The burden of this war isn't being shared equally among Russian citizens. Understanding this demographic manipulation is crucial to grasping why Russia turned to foreign recruitment. Russia isn't conscripting from Moscow's financial districts or St. Petersburg's tech centers. Instead, the military is systematically targeting the country's poorest and most ethnically diverse regions. Ethnic minorities from Siberia, the Caucasus, and Russia's Far East are being conscripted at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population. This isn't accidental. It's deliberate demographic warfare against Russia's own minorities. The lucrative military salaries being offered amount to 3 to 4 times higher than national average wages, and likely multiples of local salaries in far-off areas of Russia. These aren't genuine opportunities but desperate bribes targeting communities with no alternatives. In some cases, people don't have a choice but to be drafted, as the conscription process is online and leaves very few ways of dodging it apart from leaving the country altogether. Meanwhile, Russia's middle classes, which is the demographic that could theoretically resist Putin's war, has been systematically removing itself from the equation through mass emigration. Conservative estimates suggest that roughly 1 million educated, working-age Russians and their families have fled the country since the war began, taking with them the technical skills and potential political opposition that could challenge Putin's regime. As a result, Russian society has been hollowed to an extent that goes far beyond military casualties. The people remaining are either too poor to leave, too old to fight, or too aligned with the regime to oppose it. This demographic engineering ensures that Putin faces minimal domestic resistance while maximizing the supply of desperate recruits. But even this strategy has limits. Russia's fertility rate has been below replacement level since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The 1.2 fertility rate at the turn of the century was a demographic disaster from which the country never truly recovered despite various government incentives. The working-age population that should be supporting Russia's economy and military is shrinking every year, and a large portion of men who should be fighting the war were never born. This is why the recruitment of foreign fighters isn't just military desperation, but the only way to prop up active troop numbers. It indicates that Russia has reached the point where it cannot sustain its imperial ambitions using only its own population. And that reliance on foreign soldiers signals something even more alarming. Russia has switched from a regional power with worldly aspirations into a dependent state reliant on China, Iran, and North Korea for its basic military and economic needs. Think about the implications. If Russia needs Iranian and North Korean soldiers to fight its wars, what does this say about its ability to produce its own advanced weaponry, maintain its industrial base, or develop new technologies? The answer is deeply troubling for anyone concerned about global stability. Russia and Iran signed a strategic partnership agreement in January 2025, which would last 20 years with automatic 5-year extensions. This isn't just military cooperation, it's an acknowledgement that Russia has become dependent on Iranian drones, missiles, and now personnel to maintain its military operations. Similarly, Russia's relationship with China has evolved from partnership to dependency. Russia now relies on Chinese components for everything from semiconductor chips to industrial machinery, while China purchases Russian energy at steep discounts that effectively subsidize Chinese manufacturing at Russia's expense. The pattern is clear. Russia is becoming what economists call a resource curse state. A country that exports raw materials and imports finished goods, including the military equipment needed to maintain its security. This is the economic profile of a developing nation, not a global superpower. And there's more. This dependency relationship makes Russia increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. Remember that Russia was technically never a developing state, but was an entire hegemony during the 20th century due to the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. As Russia's conventional military capabilities continue to deteriorate, the temptation to rely on nuclear weapons only grows. If Putin becomes desperate enough, he might shed any semblance of logic to inflict maximum damage on his perceived opponents, which include both Ukraine and the West. Finally, we reach the most crucial understanding of why this war continues despite its obvious cost to Russia. Putin doesn't just want Ukrainian territory, he needs Ukrainian people. Ukraine's population of approximately 40 million represents a massive demographic prize for Russia, which is facing a demographic decline. More importantly, Ukrainians are culturally and linguistically similar enough to Russians that integration would be relatively straightforward compared to the complex ethnic minorities within Russia's current borders. This already happened when both countries were a part of the Soviet Union, as Ukrainians were resettled across Russia's European holdings after the Union's devastating casualties in World War II. This also explains why Russian forces have focused so heavily on kidnapping Ukrainian children and forcibly relocating Ukrainian civilians. By mid-March 2025, 19,000 Ukrainian children remained missing, and Western estimates suggest that this is only a portion of the true extent of Russia's kidnapping efforts. From Putin's perspective, conquering Ukraine solves multiple problems simultaneously. It eliminates a Western-aligned neighbor, provides access to valuable agricultural and industrial resources, and most importantly, delivers a massive infusion of working-age population to offset Russia's demographic decline. This is why negotiations are doomed to fail. Putin isn't just fighting for territory, he's fighting for Russia's long-term survival as he perceives it. Until this fundamental motivation is understood and addressed, the cycle of Russian aggression will continue. The North Korean and Iranian troops on the front lines are just symptoms. The disease is Russia itself, which needs to consume its neighbors, former Soviet Union countries, to survive. But what do you think? Does Russia's increasing reliance on foreign fighters signal the beginning of the end for Putin's imperial project? Or will this dependency model provide enough military capability to achieve his objectives in Ukraine? Thanks for watching as always, and leave your comments below.